driving home one morning, I think it might have been from church on a Sunday morning, and up ahead on the road, driving through a rural area, up ahead on the road, I saw two small shapes lurching in a really unusual fashion across the road. I was curious. I pulled over to the side of the road, and what I discovered was that these were 2-day-old, they must have just been hatched, they were no bigger than the size of a quarter, day-old snapping turtles. So I picked them up, and as I picked them up, it was so interesting. As I picked them up, one of the snapping turtles totally disappeared within its shell, and the other snapping turtle extended its neck and opened its little mouth with that wonderful miniature menace and threatened me. So I put the two snapping turtles in my truck. I headed on home. I picked up my dogs, threw them in the back of the truck, and I drove on down the road to a place where I knew there was a path that I could follow along the side of a creek, where I could put these snapping turtles in the creek about a mile away from the road, so I wouldn't have to worry about them being hit by a car. And so I carried them for this mile down the path. I got to the edge of the creek, and I put the two snapping turtles in the water just at the creek side, and in an instant, both turtles disappeared. One turtle disappeared by burrowing itself into the mud. The second turtle disappeared by swimming as fast as it could into the deep water, and I was struck in the moment by how marvelous it was that regardless of what the predator was, regardless of what the danger was, one of these turtles would have survived. Now there's a couple of creative lessons, I think, that we can learn from imagining what happened with these snapping turtles. The first I like to call the power of both. The power of both is a concept that I rely upon when I'm faced with a creative challenge, when I'm faced with a problem that just seems insurmountable, where none of my choices seem to really be the proper choice. And so what I've discovered is that if I take a moment and sort of step back from that creative challenge and try to find a way to not compromise between these choices, but find the solution that incorporates all of these choices, that brings them all together into a smart strategy, that might be the very best way to proceed successfully in the resolution of this problem or in the development of a solution for a creative problem. Now, it doesn't always happen that I come up with something that captures these conflicting solutions into an idea that incorporates them both. It doesn't always happen that I come up with that both. But it almost always happens that in trying to find both, the solution that could be both, I'll find some creative way to proceed with my project, with my opportunity. So that's one lesson to be learned. The other lesson is the lesson that I think is just so ingrained in us, and that's the importance of the patterns of nature. When we were primitive beings, when we were in our early hominid state, when we were in our pre-conscious state, which is what we were when we were early human beings, the greatest intelligence, the most important intelligence that we possessed, was the intelligence to look at nature with all of its extraordinary complexity, the complexity of cycles, the complexity of diversity, all the extraordinary complexity, and find the patterns of nature that promised opportunity for us, that promised abundance for us at a time when we're living a subsistence life, where we're looking for every possible edge that we can possibly find. Just like an entrepreneur, by the way, is looking at patterns to try to find those patterns that suggest abundant opportunity. Primitive man would have been living in nature and looking at the patterns of nature and trying to determine what the patterns were that promised, that suggested opportunity, that promised abundance, that promised success. So I believe that in our most primitive mind, in that core element of our mind, that deepest part of our mind, there's this extraordinary capability to read patterns. And neuroscientists and cognitive psychologists now believe, according to their research, that this thing that we've been talking about, called intuitive leaps, called creative insight, that what that is pattern recognition. Virtually all the researchers agree that to some extent it's pattern recognition that you're engaged in when you're thinking intuitively. Some researchers believe it's almost primarily pattern recognition that your mind is practicing as it's looking for opportunity, as it's looking for the right solution to that apparently insurmountable problem. So my recommendation to you is that you, in fact, develop your capability for seeing patterns in nature. When you have a creative problem, when you have a creative challenge that you're working with, here's what I do. I will take it with me out into the woods with my dogs, and we'll go for a nice hike, and I'll look at the patterns, and I'll contemplate what it is I'm seeing. And then as I sit down under an oak tree, as I sit down by the side of a pond and start to write down what I think about this creative idea, what I think about this creative problem, it's striking to me how very often that new, fresh insight into the problem emerges as I've engaged, as I've allowed myself to enjoy and witness the patterns of nature.